Okay, I'm so ready to dive into Wired to Eat with the man, Robb Wolf, who has always been a big influence in my life. He started the CrossFit when the first and would you say?
First and fourth.
First
First
and
and fourth.
fourth CrossFit studio. As I've been in fitness industry forever, it's always followed you when you started to go into paleo and really finally someone who was bringing nutrition and exercise together. As I always say, can't out exercise poor diet. And you really started it early on, and Paleo Solution book I read years ago, and the Wired to Eat book came out a few years ago. And really looking forward to tie this into what's going on today in our nutrition as athletes are doing really too much keto, too much low carb, too much fasting. And I'm really finding a lot of what I say is FDN practitioner, we say metabolic chaos. So really looking forward to diving into your why and what's kind of bringing you to change a little bit of things up and really keep up on the research and share it with us for the athletic world.
Sure. Man, I wrote my first article on intermittent fasting in 2005, and it went out to a mainly CrossFit oriented group of folks. And by 2006, I so horribly regretted releasing that article because it was talking about some of the theory around intermittent fasting and maybe, like alternate day fasting. And one of the big problems is that we were looking at mouse model stuff, which they would alternate fast mice and get these, seemingly pretty remarkable results. But an alternate day fast for a mouse is equivalent to a 7-day fast for a human. So there's one big, flaw to this whole thing. Another piece to that, which is something that I've gone on to look at, is all this research looking at calorie restriction, protein restriction, intermittent fasting in these lab animals mainly seems to be protecting them from a super shitty lab-based diet. And I mean, I don't think it's doing anything above and beyond that. But what I saw clinically, the best part of it that I saw was that some people were like, oh, I don't need to eat 6 meals a day. One day maybe I eat 2, one day maybe I don't eat any because I just get really, really busy, and it's not the end of the world. And that was literally the high water mark for the benefits. And the negatives were, I felt pretty good for 2 weeks, and then my hair started falling out, and I had no libido, and I had total retrograde performance, and on and on and on. And I mean, the negatives far outweighed the positives from what I was seeing in this super type A, over the top, athlete population. And when you would talk to folks, it's like, okay, so what are you doing? I intermittent fast 22 hours a day. I ate 5 grams of carbs last month, and I do 2-a-day CrossFit workouts, but I do take a couple of days off where I only do hot yoga, a ruck march with a 50-pound weight vest, and on and on and on. And I mean, you can't find somebody who's a bigger fan of ketogenic diets, low carb diets than I am, but I really had to do remarkable mental gymnastics to not see the catastrophe that was occurring in front of me, with these folks. And it was interesting because in an otherwise kind of sedentary, not super active population, and you start doing some carbohydrate restriction, it's magic. Like, it's magic. It controls appetite. People aren't hangry. For the first time in their life, they're able to spontaneously control calorie intake in a way that fosters great body composition and good metabolic numbers and everything. But then it just seemed to be too much of a good thing, and I guess I've been on this, fighting both the mainstream, which is still in this position that like low carb diets are dangerous and fattest and, all this other stuff. It's just bullshit. I mean, they're a very viable tool, but like any tool, they're not the only tool. Like a hammer is amazing, but if you want to do a precision cut in a piece of wood, a hammer is a terrible tool, and we, by and large have not been super good. Folks have generally not been all that great at creating some nuance within this thing. So I know that was a long rambling answer, but that's kind of been my, 15, 16 year, experience around that topic, intermittent fasting, athletic performance and whatnot, because it was around 2005 that I started working with a fairly athletic population. Prior to that, it was just people with autoimmune disease, gut issues, and metabolic syndrome. And low carb diets, low FODMAP, low carb type diets all day long for that first group of, kind of gut autoimmune metabolic issues that you can't get enough of that stuff with those folks. But as people start exercising higher volume, higher intensity, then, things change. And I guess the one thing that I would throw in, additional filler with that is what I eventually discovered is a ketogenic diet for that high motor athlete might mean 200 grams of carbs a day. Yeah. And they're still in ketosis all the damn time. Like they're, or if they bump out, it's for like 20 minutes after the meal and then they're right back in, and they seem to thread the needle then of getting all this great kind of neuro resilience and blood sugar resilience of a fat adapted approach, but then being able to go high motor when they need to go and not have it totally cook them and burn them out and destroy their adrenals and all the rest of that stuff.
So I was smiling because that's exactly what I feel like it's my purpose on this show. I just kind of relaunching a new season and just really dialing this in because it's what I did. 2005, I'm more the endurance side. CrossFit is what I need to do because I'm so not the plyometric person, but endurance sports is what I did. And I was doing the low heart rate training. I was doing fasted workouts. I was doing, fasting all day without knowing it and training a lot. And I got, so-called adrenal exhaustion in 2013. And now I see as an FDN practitioner and nutritional therapy practitioner and working with Ben Greenfield that, all right, there's a whole area we're not talking about. And I've talked to Dr. Mindy. I saw you're just on her show and, they're talking these great stuff. Like you just said, is great for people that aren't exercising, but what about the athletes and what about the female athlete and the aging athlete? I think I really want to address that on this show now, because I just think people hear all those recommendations, the athlete, because we're type A driven, ambitious, high performing individual. And we do that. And we're creating total hormone disruption, all this other stuff going on because we're doing too much, because we think more is better. And we're not tailoring it to, if I work out a lot, if I do high intensity, if I do endurance exercise, fasting too much can not always be good. So I love what you're sharing, because I feel like that's what we need to get that out, because no one's really addressing that part.
Yeah, it's interesting looking back at, I guess, kind of the history of this stuff. Paleo came on the scene pretty hard, and I think it huge contributions. Like it really made the case for food quality. It highlighted some concerns around autoimmunity, gut health. There were a lot of important characteristics there. But at the end of the day, from a research perspective, it's like, what does a paleo diet mean? Like how much protein, how many carbs, how much fat. And so that was problematic, and it actually made it difficult to study in a systematic way. And that's part of the reason why the ketogenic diet is so amenable to scientific research. And if you go to PubMed and you put in ketogenic diet and you look at the little timeline of, the number of studies, it's just gone, it exploded because it really lends itself to this quantifiable biological endpoint. Are you in ketosis or not? And so then all this focus shifted into ketogenic diets, which I think is really valuable in a lot of ways. But then the whole spectrum of just kind of lower carb diet got lost. The average American eats something like 400 grams of carbs a day. Yeah. And simply taking people to 150 or, God forbid, maybe even 200 grams of carbs a day might be a huge win for most of these people. It would still afford them lots of flexibility with their diet. And it still is giving some improvements with glycemic response and blood sugar control and all that type of stuff. But this fascination with ketosis, which again, I think is understandable because it's a quantifiable biological endpoint for scientific study. That's great. But then we just lost this whole spectrum of, like moderate and low carb diets that are really hugely beneficial for a lot of people. And ketogenic diets don't necessarily need to be the first whistle stop that people jump on with dietary change.
Yeah. And I say that a low carb athlete doesn't mean zero carbs. And I think a lot of people think of keto, like I help with this group page of keto endurance and the keto athlete, that people think, zero carbs is what we're looking at. And I think it's like you said, and Ben Greenfield says this too, you can have 100 to 200 grams of carbs and still stay in ketosis. And the benefit of not always being in ketosis, that metabolic flexibility and then switching in and out of ketosis shows a lot of benefits as well. So let me kind of go into your book and kind of tailor it a little bit more to what we're talking about. But Wired to Eat, and from the paleo solution to Wired to Eat, why did you feel like there's a need to fine tune or individualize things a little bit differently?
Had I been more entrepreneurial, I would have written like 4 books in that intervening time. Like it was almost 10 years between those two, or at least 6-8 years. But I felt like the Paleo Solution was a pretty good book, and I really wanted something qualitatively different to be able to talk about. And I definitely, like, my treatment of like the paleo diet in Wired to Eat is ironically far better than in the Paleo Solution, but it's 8 years later. Yeah. So there's lots more research and more perspective and all that type of stuff. But two big things popped up. And one of them was this, a real awakening on my side with this understanding about the neuroregulation of appetite. Like there was a paper that I was exposed to, Determinants of Brain Evolution, the Omnivore's Real Dilemma. And it was just mind-blowing paper, and really made this case that humans are wired to eat more and move less. And it was this medical anthropologist who did this. And unfortunately, I found this paper maybe 3 months after this guy died. Like he was at Emory University, and I would have so loved to chat with this guy. But this paper just kind of blew my mind, and it made sense of like the low carb versus high carb drama. It was really made the case that adequate protein is what normalizes all this. Like if you were under eating protein, you will overeat other macronutrients. Full stop, end of story. And because of the optimum foraging strategy and protein leverage hypothesis, if an organism eats adequate protein, it will tend to, normalize its calorie intake and kind of match calorie with the activity level. So that was a huge deal. Like that to me cut through all the BS on like the high carb versus low carb. And there's probably some individualization on that, but it wasn't enough for a whole book. But the second piece that came in was this personalized nutrition part that came from the research out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And what it suggested, or it painted this picture where they did all this super interesting analysis on folks. They did a gut microbiome test, they did genetic testing, they did advanced lipidology, and then they put a glucose monitor on people, a CGM, and they started feeding them meals. And the blood glucose responses with these folks were all over the map. Like one person would eat a cookie, and it looked like they just drank water. Like they would barely have a bump in their blood sugar. And another person would eat a cookie and their blood sugar would go sky high. And then the flip side of that would happen with a banana with another person. Like, and so you had the cookie versus banana. Like for one person, a banana produced much higher blood glucose levels than a cookie did. And then vice versa with other people. I was like, well, shoot, this really calls into question, like any broad reaching dietary recommendations. Like again, other than like start with adequate protein, then we need to figure out the amounts and types of carbohydrate that people do well with, and then, kind of customize from there. And I guess the final little piece to that is be aware of immunogenic foods. Like some people have gluten issues, some people have issues with dairy or, nightshades or whatever, but it's kind of like the cherry on the sundae with all this stuff. And so that was the front end piece, was this understanding of the neuroregulation of appetite and understanding that we are wired to eat more and move less. And so like the fact that people struggle in the modern dietary world is totally understandable. it's not your fault, but we also can't just roll over and accept our situation because we're all dying, you know? And so we've got to do something. And the thing that we do is look at our personalized nutrition and do a little bit of experimentation where we find the amounts and types of carbohydrates that work best for us. And we can, you know, tinker and modify that over time. But that was really the impetus and the whole plan around Wired to Eat. And it's interesting, like Wired to Eat did well. It didn't sell as well as the Paleo solution, except within practitioner circles. So like doctors, coaches, like that, it really has been super popular because it helps people to set up a template for working with people. Like it provides a very step-by-step template for helping to roll out dietary interventions for folks.
Yeah, I know well, I think what year did the book come out? Because you were speaking
2016, I think. Yeah.
So, because you were speaking about this book was just coming out at Nutritional Therapy Conference in Vancouver, Portland, Washington. And of course, it was the last one of the day and I had to drive back to Seattle, so I missed it. But I remember it came out and it's just what we talk about in nutritional therapy. I always hate labeling how I eat. It's just eat real food that balances your blood sugar, you know, we individualize it based on like what you talk about in the book. We'll talk about the carb tolerance test that everyone's different and it could be great food, but then it could cause my glucose to go sky high. Like these so-called keto foods, if they have stevia even, can cause my blood sugar to go up, and monk fruit. And so it's really what we do as practitioners, or what I do is look at what foods work best for your body, testing and not guessing, and looking at the whole picture, as you just said, the ancestry background, what are your microbiome bacteria levels, and looking at all this to really customize. And that's what your book is a great way to start. If you're not working with a health coach or practitioner, you don't want to spend the money on labs. Here's how you can get started. A simple test, the 7-day carb tolerance test, I think is so essential for athletes because it isn't a one size fits all. We're all bio individuals. So it's a 30-day reset, but let's talk about, I don't know what works better, to talk about the 7-day test first and then 30 days.
Sure. Yeah. You know, because it's funny, in the book, I put the 7-day carb test at the end. And in reflection, I think that was a silly thing to do for a variety of reasons. But the 7-day carb test is a process where and if you can do a continuous glucose monitor, that's great. But what we ended up recommending is just a finger stick, you know, blood glucose testing, and you pick 5-7 carbohydrates that you want to eat. And we eat those ideally the same time, first thing in the morning. And that's your breakfast, like that's your initial breakfast. And we do a blood glucose test before you eat it, then you eat it. And then ideally we test it 1 hour and 2 hours. You don't have to. Some people only test it 2 hours. And we would like to see your blood glucose response remain under 115 nanograms per deciliter. And what's kind of, and even that is higher than what I would really like. Like I would like it to be a little bit lower than that. And Peter Attia and some other people have made some cases for why they would like to see it lower than that. But I provided a little bit of latitude on that. But I was basing this off of the blood glucose responses that have been documented in hunter-gatherer and pre-agricultural societies, where they will give these folks oral glucose tolerance tests and see how they do. And what's fascinating, these people tend to be pretty small. Like the men are 135 pounds, women a little smaller than that because they live in these pretty marginalized areas, but they have remarkably robust blood glucose responses while they're eating their ancestral diet. And some of the extrapolation that I took from all that was that if we figure out a way of keeping our blood glucose within kind of ancestral bounds, then we tend to not get the advanced glycation end product damage. So like the sugars sticking to proteins and enzymes and causing problems. I think that the blood sugar highs and lows really feed into a tendency to overeat. And so it helps with satiety. And, you know, it just seems to help. It helps with gut issues. This was some of what the Weizmann Institute research suggested, interestingly, was that blood sugar highs really fed into dysbiosis, interestingly, in the gut, and that normalizing blood glucose levels were really beneficial for normalizing dysbiotic gut issues. So, you checking those blood glucose levels is really valuable. And like Nikki and I did a comparison, and just observationally, we've always known that Nikki handled carbs better than I would. Like occasionally we'd go out and do some Mexican food, and she would, do some beans and rice. I'm like, how do you feel after that? And she's like, oh, if I really burn it down, I'll feel kind of rough for like an hour or something, and then I'm fine. I'm like, dude, I would feel awful for like 3 days if I ate what she ate. But we tested 50 grams of carbohydrate in the form of white rice. We cooked it, 1 cup, ate it, tracked everything. Nikki never really got above about 115, 120 maybe. And I was at like 198, and
me.
felt horrible afterwards, had vision changes and all kinds of problems. And it doesn't mean that I can never, ever eat white rice, but I might need to dramatically reduce the amount. I might need to reduce the amount and eat it after workouts. I might need to take a walk with it. I might need to eat some protein, fat, and vegetables with it. Like there's all these mitigating steps, but the carb test is really testing your tolerance and I guess your tolerance for a given carbohydrate under the worst circumstance possible. Like we're not doing any of the mitigating stuff. We're not eating it with protein. We're not eating it with fiber. We're not purposefully going on a walk afterwards. Like we're really just looking at your pancreas versus carbohydrate. Like go, how does this work? And what it's done for people is it's kind of liberated them in that maybe they don't, maybe they end up with a blood glucose that's like 130 or 140. It's not as good as what we would want, but if we cut that portion in half, they're great. But then they're having some quinoa or some rice or some things like that. And so it's broadening out their dietary options, while also helping them to figure out, how to maintain their blood glucose under the kind of more optimized levels. And again, like simply doing a walk after a meal can dramatically mitigate that peak, the blood glucose peak, and also the total area under the curve, partitioning carbohydrates more to post-workout and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of things that can be done. But testing it under worst case scenario is very, I think, remarkably valuable for helping people to dial in on how important it is to at least take this stuff seriously.
Well, then you get individualize it into that carb timing for athletes, and, best to have something before or after, or if it's nighttime to help sleep and performance the next day, and then really tweak it and learn more about that person's own carb tolerance and their sensitivity to carbs. So testing it with, like, say, a Keto to Mojo type of glucose device, and would you do probably easier to do a continuous glucose monitor, so you have to prick your finger 10 times.
Yeah, I mean, the CGM, so you only do it once per day with the meal, or you do it ideally, first thing fasted at 1 hour and then at 2 hours. And it's 3 times a day. It's not a huge deal. And the bugger about CGMs is that they're great for trends, but they have remarkably large error bars with the precise or the accuracy of it. Like, is it really the true value? And I mean, even things like the Keto Mojo, the best of the finger prick stuff has a 10 to 15% error bar with it. So like if you're reading 100, it could be 110, it could be 90, and so that's where sometimes doing serial, tests of that. But the CGMs have more of like a 20% error at any given moment, because they're checking the interstitial fluid, not the venous fluid, and on and on. Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to test your pulse too. So we do, easy way to do food sensitivities is a Cocoa Pulse test and do your pulse. So it'd be good to, pulse, prick, and do it together at the same time and kind of correlate. Are you reactive to that food? Is that a food that your body's sensitive to, as well as seeing that correlation with the spike in the glucose, see how it happened. And then like you're talking that you're gluten and dairy intolerant, that, all right, is that cross-reactive with the gluten? So maybe is it, your body sensing that, and how does it respond? Because I find like I had corn tortilla, moving to San Diego, I started eating tacos. I'm like, okay, I definitely can't do corn tortilla because my glucose would go like 170, and then I'd switch to a lettuce wrap. But it is, learning about each person's response, I think, is so essential to really personalize our nutrition plan and then, timing it with exercise and really tweaking it to what type of workout. So with this, and you do the 30-day reset, does that just teach you how to be more metabolically efficient, more fat adapted, trying to figure out what works for you, or what do you want people to get out of the 30-day reset for athletes?
For athletes specifically, I mean, again, that's going to be super individually driven. Like, is the person trying to gain muscle, or are they more of an endurance versus power athlete? Where are they at in like a training block? I guess at a minimum, we're gaining some awareness of glycemic response, and then, potentially like food sensitivity responses. I didn't include the tracking change in pulse, but I did have people pay attention to, like, do they become foggy headed, lethargic? Do they get any gut issues? That was kind of more the angle that but I like that pulse. I don't know why it didn't occur to me to put that in the book, but we were definitely looking at some of those more subjective elements as well, because like for myself, I do really well glycemically with lentils. Like those things are great, but I get kind of like a rheumatoid deal, and my joints ache, like my fingers and everything ache from lentils, and it sucks because they taste good, they're cheap. I can mix them in with a lot of other foods. They have a fair, decent nutrient profile for a plant, item, but damn if they don't like cause kind of an autoimmune response in me. So I crushed it. They're great for me glycemically, but from an autoimmune and gut perspective, I don't really do that well with them. So I think it's important to check both those. So the takeaways for an athlete, I think definitely being aware of your glycemic response, and then, any type of food sensitivity issues, so that, that information then can feed into, well, what is my next training block? What's my next goal that I'm going for?
I think so many athletes think they're invincible and that they can eat whatever they want. And that's why I always loved, because I was in the fitness industry, personal trainer for years, and that you always promoted the paleo. And we didn't do CrossFit, but just like, okay, that's so great to get athletes finally to pay attention to eating real food, because so many athletes, whatever sport they do, think I work out, I can eat whatever I want. And I used to, marathons and Ironmans, you see overweight people. It's like, okay, endurance exercise isn't really good for your fat burning, but I think it is really learning how to eat real food, as we said, to balance your blood sugar, but really individualize it for people that want to burn fat. Because I think a lot of athletes struggle, as I just said, trying to lose weight. They're exercising, but they're still over fat and not really getting results. So I think this book would kind of help them figure out how to get started with being fat adapted in a way, because it's almost like a 30-day reset. That is, if you are a carb burner and you want to switch to become more fat adapted, this is a good journey to get started with.
Yeah. And I think I do mention respiratory quotient in there. And there are some things like Lumen and a few other folks that talk about respiratory quotient. And I like that stuff. I really was super geeked out on all of that 5-6 years ago. And it's cool, but it also becomes this thing where it's like, okay, I'm fat adapted. Now what? Yeah, again, depending on the person, that might be a tool that I drop into the toolbox, but like the whole topic of metabolic flexibility and respiratory quotient, like 6 years ago, I was all fired up about it. And then when I started looking at it, I realized that I was going to have to lie to myself and lie to a lot of other people to spin this up into this like really world changing, soup to nuts information. It's or at least that's my opinion on it. Like I think it, again, it's valuable as a tool, but it's not like a comprehensive system that can exist around that.
Well, I used to do metabolic testing cart on people back in 2005. And that's when I started learning about RQ value and all that, testing people on the treadmill or the bike and at rest, and really start paying attention to this information we're getting from those tests. But it was this company called New Leaf, and then Lifetime Fitness bought the company. And then we were able to test again, but I know there's other companies that come out with that. But so that kind of leads me to the question for athletes: do you want to be fat burning all the time? We talked about metabolic flexibility, in and out of like burning fat and then switch to burning carbs. Because obviously HIIT training, CrossFit type of more intense workouts, you're going to be burning more glycogen. So it's not, teaching people that are into keto, into low carb, that I need to just burning fat, carbs are all evil, but you're using those fuels, and it is necessary to be able to flip the switch.
Yeah. And it's something that's important for, fat adapted athletes to understand is even if you choose, it's like, I'm not going to eat any carbs, like let's say you go pure carnivore, your muscles will end up with some glycogen in. Gluconeogenesis is a thing. You will top off your glycogen. And interestingly, once people are fat adapted in general, a fat adapted low carb athlete, the muscle glycogen may not be that much different than somebody who eats a significant amount of carbs. But what's interesting is when you're thrown into that high intensity, like interval training type stuff, CrossFit or mixed martial arts or something like that, it disproportionately crushes the person who is low carb. And I think that that's kind of a central governor thing. The brain actually regulates a lot of what's going on with our energy status. Like they've done studies where they'll run people to exhaustion on a treadmill, and they'll give these folks a sweet tasting but non-caloric, drink, and they just swizzle it in their mouth and spit it out. And if they just taste something sweet, they can run another like 5% or something like that, because the brain is like, oh, I got a little nutrition, so I can open things up and let the person go a little bit more. And I think a lot of what's happening is if you do high intensity activity, you will burn carbs. The question is, where are those carbs coming from, and what will the hormonal consequences be? If we dump some carbs in beforehand or right around the workout so that it's not as stressful, then it's going to be more of an adaptive kind of process. We'll release some growth hormone. You definitely release cortisol and whatnot too, because that's the nature of stress. But we won't be completely catabolizing protein, including like our body's protein, to turn it into glucose, to burn it as carbohydrate. It won't be as stressful of a process. Our average heart rate is going to be 8 or 10 beats per minute less at any given work output. So if we do high intensity interval training, you will burn some glycogen one way or the other. The question is, what is the context of that glycogen getting burnt? Is it your body struggling to get any carbohydrate from any source possible, converting it via gluconeogenesis, or are we, maybe dropping in some pre-workout carbs in the form of like a targeted ketogenic diet? Are we doing more of a block periodization thing where when we're doing the interval training, we just preemptively put in a lot more, a decent amount of more carbohydrate, like in our day-to-day fueling? And there's a million ways to do this stuff, and that's where it kind of makes my head spin, because I'm not entirely sure, well, do we do this for this person or that for that person? But I have noticed that when we start really consistently playing with hard intervals in particular, or really high volume, above lactate level activity, having at least some carbs in the mix, it just seems to cause more of an adaptive response instead of just cratering the person. And again, in the beginning, I think that folks can do this stuff and they feel good and they make some progress. They go full carnivore or something like that, and they're able to make this stuff work. But I think over the course of time, like some folk, the thing to keep your eye open for, like if you're crushing it, if your libido is good, your blood lipids look good and everything, then fine. Whatever you're doing is great. But if you can't remember being horny for like 2 years and your hair is falling out and and on and on and on, then there's a problem there. Like we are not dealing with health anymore. Like we are doing something completely antagonistic to health at that point. And so then we need to get in and reevaluate what we're doing.
Yeah. So I think, what I've found over the last few years when people have gotten more into these fasted exercises, that again, it's more is better philosophy, and that there, I had someone that in our keto endurance group share that she and this is not just one person, but people do 24 to 48 hour fast, and they'll do CrossFit workout each day and they feel amazing. And I want to message a person going, okay, that might be okay now, but I don't know long-term if that's really good for your hormones, and pay attention to those red flags. But I think so many people, one, feel guilty if they have carbs because we became an industry saying carbs are evil in this world and think zero carbs is better. And often I think people exercise. Yeah, I feel good, fasted, but could have I felt better? Could have I nailed that workout even better? If it's a bike ride or strength hit, CrossFit, can I improve that performance? But I think people, oh, I can do it fasted. I did great. But there's that question is, are you hurting your body, doing more harm than good in the long term?
Yeah, early in the that kind of fasted training, it's a massive stress, and biology is kind of like, okay, this person is dying, like they're in a fight for their life.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to turn everything on. The dopamine is turned on. People will say, I'm not sleeping as much. I'm not super productive. They're almost in, like in a manic depressive kind of thing. They're in almost a manic phase because biology is perceiving all of this stress as a fight for your life scenario. But the thing is, biology can't keep that up indefinitely. You get 2 or 3 weeks in, and then the person craters. So yeah, you can feel wonderful on like fasted low carb training initially, but then over the course of time, this is creating more of a stress than a benefit. And I think also some people tolerate it better than others. Like some people legitimately really seem to do okay, particularly if it's more like zone 2 cardio type stuff versus, for me, I just don't feel all that well in general with it. One other thought too, and this is where it's hazardous to create too many rules around much of anything. Yeah. I have had athletes do tested training while fasted. So let's say they're going to do a 2K row, or they're going to do an 800-meter run or something like that. We train them up for this, but if the individual's gut is totally empty, there is no energy, no blood flow being diverted to the gut to process food. So you get more blood flow to go to the muscles and to the heart and lungs. And not infrequently, I've had people PR high intensity activity while fasted, but we tested them once. We don't train them that way all the time. And you have to make the timing of the test appropriate so we don't end up in a hypoglycemic situation. But there is kind of a reality that a completely empty gut is a not bad thing to have when you're doing an 800-meter run, when you're doing a 10K run, 10K row, something like that, because we have more than enough energy stored in our body. And if we're not dealing with our gut, shifting nutrients, out, or basically blood flow, away from the gut, then it can serve the muscles.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is, I don't like to eat before workouts. So I like to do fasted workouts, but I'm finding myself go, okay, it's all right to have some calories, because I've read some studies, female athletes do better eating some calories, but that can be liquid, like putting collagen and MCT oil creamer in my coffee. And that's some calories to give me a good workout and be safe, not causing more stressors in my body, thinking I'm breaking it down. And my hormones are already low already, so I don't want more stress on my body. But then men might do better eating right afterwards. So have you really experimented with the male versus female athlete of when to eat before and after workout, or, what to eat?
Not really. I've really, my main observation in that story is that we see like that female athlete triad thing, like overreaching, overtraining.
Yeah.
It becomes more obvious with women much more quickly. Amenorrhea, performance changes, hair loss, thyroid alterations. I think clearly that stuff happens with men, like the hormonal axis and whatnot getting dysregulated. But just biologically, like if women are under stress, then biology doesn't want them to be pregnant or to get pregnant. So I think that switch flips. But it's so interesting. I see I see people make a lot out of, like, there's this huge difference between men and a huge difference between women. I think there's far more difference individual than there is between the sexes. There may be some trends one way or the other, but here's an interesting, for example. I was poking around trying to find examples of people who were eating keto who were successful in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I didn't find a lot, but the people that I found were all female, and they had all been doing it for like 3 or 4 years, and they were competing at a very high level, and they were legitimately eating keto. And maybe two of the 4 were like type 1 diabetics. And so they really didn't play with carbs. They were just like, I wouldn't choose to do this, but that's what I've done. And a couple of the other people were just like, I feel great. And they motored. So the most successful people that I saw on low carb and high intensity activity were women. But I also saw the most cratered, husks of burned out, broken people as women. So what does that mean? Like, I think there may be more spread within a female population. Some may do exceptionally well, and some may break exceptionally easy or exceptionally hard when they go. So again, I think people are like, oh, women need to do this and men need to do that. I don't know. I just don't know. I think that's where,
Genetics.
let's look at the individual across from us and just like, well, let's play with this and see what happens, instead of going in with because I may be wrong on this, but I just found greater variation from person to person, regardless of gender, than there was like some sort of like hard, fast things around gender, other than the signs and symptoms of overreaching, overtraining, undernutrition were much more obvious in women much earlier than in men, and usually a lot more difficult to fix once you broke them.
Yeah, mine's 8 years. So I know I've been trying to fix myself for many years. So I think a lot of that, I like to think of it looking at genetics for clients and myself, because and personality part of the genetics, but looking at how you deal with stress, and then how many stressors do you have in your life? Like, I own my own fitness studio in downtown Bellevue, $7,000 to $8,000 a month of rent overhead. For 10 years, I was stressed out doing all you do for owning your own fitness studio. Anybody's owning a own business is a crap load of stuff, especially when you're training and coaching clients all day. Right. And then you have to do all the other stuff. So you're always on and you don't know how to shut it off. So those people that are doing stressful job, I never could have kids, take note of hormone dysfunction, that, you need to add exercise on top of that. And I trained a high level for Ironmans and marathons and cycling, that, how many stressors are you having in your life? I think that's a big influence on how you respond, because if you look at the beaker of stress analogy, I just keep dumping more stuff in there, and then that's going to change male or female.
Yeah.
So going back, because I know people are going to want to talk more about the targeted ketogenic diet that Luis talks on, the keto gains versus nutritional ketosis for more athletes, because I think people think they have to be in ketosis all the time, or be this certain way. And I'd love to hear you about low carb versus nutritional ketosis. You talked a little bit about carnivore, insulin resistance. What is the athlete ideal kind of template? Because it's always N=1 by individual. What do we want to look at for working with athletes?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, Luis and Tyler seem to get a lot of mileage out of the targeted approach. They're generally more working with people that are lifting weights and kind of body recomposition type stuff. Most of the things that I'm concerned about are a little, like jujitsu, and I don't do much one-on-one coaching or training anymore. I kind of help it, kind of observe it like the team level. And personally, I've found it just a little easier to just do a little bit more carbs consistently. So almost like a zone type deal, where it's like 20 grams of carbs per meal, or 30 grams of carbs per meal, breakfast, lunch, dinner, 90 grams of carbs a day. Maybe we vary that based off of training days. Maybe I go a little bit harder post workout, with carb repletion, especially if I'm looking towards tomorrow. So like my week with jujitsu, I do a private on Mondays, and then I don't have anything until Wednesday. And then it's usually a class, and depending on what we have going on, maybe I stay for open rolling. So it may be an hour of rolling. Maybe I only get like 20 minutes of that though. And then nothing Thursday because it's my podcast day. And then Friday is always a big open mat deal. So I do the class, then an hour or longer of open mat. And then Saturday is a 2-hour open mat. So the back end of my week gets really stacked with jujitsu. And orthopedically, I feel it like my ribs get squishy and, all this stuff. But I find that I kind of backfill more of the carbs later in the week. So like Friday, because I have a long class and then I've got Saturday coming, I'll usually do close to 100 grams of carbs that day. And I make sure that my element and my electrolytes are all on point and all that type of stuff. But then earlier in the week, I'm doing very, very little. So I need less. And again, I know I'm kind of bouncing around there. For my personal fueling, I've found a little bit more consistent carbs is easier. And part of that is just jujitsu. I don't really know what I'm going to get that day. Like I might have somebody 50 pounds heavier than I am, as technical as I am. And so it's going to be a shit day for me. Like it's just going to be a rough day, and shooting some pre-workout calories is rough. Like having somebody stick their knee in your belly and posture up, and you've got some, it's just not fun. So part of the reason why I skirt around that is I don't really know what the demands of my day are really going to be. I don't know how hard it's going to be. And so it's easier to just have a background of a little bit of carbs going on. I do supplement sometimes with like 5 grams, 10 grams of like glucose tablets on some of these jujitsu days. Whereas like if I was just doing strength training, I know what my volume, I know what my intensity is going to be, and I can kind of plan for that. And so I would feel more comfortable ingesting like 20 grams of carbs right before the event. Like the jujitsu is just enough unknowns that I like, and sometimes the timing gets difficult. So I don't have the time to go over and like do my shake before, people start mauling me and everything. And so there's kind of that like, just kind of logistics to it. So there's a lot going on there. Like there's a lot more than just like the optimum fueling for like protein, carbs, fat. There's also the logistics and like the GI discomfort, not knowing what I'm going to face that day. I could see something kind of similar with like, maybe I've never been an endurance athlete, but I mean, if you know what your course is and you know what the temperature and the humidity, you can kind of predict what you're in for that day. But like if you're kind of a CrossFit athlete and you're getting ready to drive to the gym and you don't really know what you're going to get that day, you don't know if you want to do 10 grams of carbs or 20 grams of carbs, and do you want it sitting in your gut while you're doing stuff. So yeah. I don't know if any of that's helpful, but I mean, I just see a lot of moving parts with it.
Well, that's why you just N equals 1 and it's complicated.
It
depends.
It kind of is. Yeah.
Because as you said, it depends on the day, depends on my schedule, the timing, the intensity of the workout. That's why, working with a coach, I think is so essential to personalize and tweak and course correct based on, how you're feeling. And then if you can test with, what you're doing, like if it's a erg workout and, your splits or bike workout, whatever it is, you need some type of metric. So, did this work or not, and how you can change it next time and really keep a workout log, or if you're using Training Peaks and log in, I did this today, this worked, and my watts were a lot better or whatever. But that's what's so hard is people want to answer. I was funny because I'm speaking at KetoCon this year on fueling and training low carb athlete, and people are going to be disappointed because I'm like, it depends. I can't tell you anything, but here's what can happen if you do it wrong. And really not listening to your body and identifying those red flags when you're not doing enough carbs, when you are being too strict on doing keto or too strict on fasting. That I find that's more is like people are doing too much and avoiding those red flags because they're driven, ambitious, type A. I can push through it. I'm a hardcore athlete. And that's where they get screwed up. I think it's like whatever works for you, but what about those red flags when you're doing it too much? We can obviously see that happen if
Yep.
you feel like crap the next day, and look at that maybe instead of, oh, that worked great, but it's easy probably to see what worked the wrong way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So just if you could remind or explain people, they don't know what the targeted keto versus like nutritional ketosis. And then there's like the 5-1-1 people go in and out, like a high carb day,
Yeah.
low carb day. What's the targeted ketogenic diet?
Yeah. So targeted is when folks typically have been kind of fat adapted in a standard nutritional ketogenic diet for about 3 months. Recommendations vary on that, but they recommend that people get thoroughly fat adapted, and they really are they have mapped and figure out what their basic nutritional ketogenic diet is. And then the targeted approach is putting in some amount of carbs, somewhere between 5 maybe up to 25-30 grams of carbs, although it's interesting. Like Luis really is very conservative on that. Like I'm shocked in some ways, like how little he generally recommends, but they get phenomenal results with people too. But and again, the interesting thing about that, they will introduce carbs right around the time of training to improve performance. And what's interesting to me about that again is it's not going to get into the glycogen, so it's not addressing muscle glycogen. Mm-hmm. What I think it's doing is that central governor thing again. Like the brain senses that there's some exogenous carbohydrates that came in, there's some calories. So this doesn't need to be as stressful of a training session. We want stress from our training session, but we want that stress so that we can adapt to it and get better, versus that stress just like cratering us and it becoming such a deep hole that it's hard to dig ourselves out of it. And it seems like that targeted ketogenic approach is effective for a lot of people. It's been used within bodybuilding circles for a long time. And again, this is very much my personal experience, but I've found that targeted ketogenic approach is most beneficial, most useful when you really understand what the demands are that you're going to face. Like if okay, you've got a pull-up, back squat, Romanian deadlift workout, and then you're going to do 20 minutes of low intensity cardio on the treadmill. Like it really seems to lend itself to that. Whereas things like CrossFit, jiu-jitsu, like the targeted approach can help, but I've found it to be a little bit more challenging to match stuff, and that it's actually ironically better to just kind of have a little bit more background carbs in general in those, like combatives and like Spartan races, like, obstacle course races and stuff like that. Yeah. Where it's a little more open-ended and you're not really quite sure what you're going to get that day. Mm-hmm. I find it'll just, and again, not high carb, just higher carb, maybe 100 grams of carbs a day, versus 600 grams of carbs, which a lot of athletes are eating, or maybe it's 200 grams. Yeah. Versus 0. Yeah.
So I think it's, what I keep saying this year is I just turned 50, that it's more looking at performance now, but I want people to look at longevity. And I know, a lot of people, as Ben Greenfield speaking of, let's look at your, the future you. And I love to look at, okay, what are you doing now to work on who you're going to be at 60, 70, 80, 90 years old? And I think athletes, they work themselves hard. There's a lot of people doing, way too much hard and high intensity workout or chronic cardio, but, working on our health building lifestyle habits, working on nutrition and listening to your body, individualizing. What would you say to help people work on the longevity part?
Man, don't avoid protein. Don't do shitloads of fasting. Like I'm going to do a bunch of don'ts here. I right at the beginning of the COVID deal, I spoke at Metabolic Health Summit, and my talk was longevity. Are we trying too hard? And I for a long time I've been in kind of loggerheads with some of the folks that are really verklempt over lots and lots of fasting and lots of calorie restriction and protein restriction and everything. I think when you look critically at that stuff, all that is demonstrating is that if you have a lab animal that is fed terrible food, that they will do better eating less of that food than more of it. And what I really want to see in these like longevity research things and the, you know, protein restriction and calorie restriction. Compare the calorie restricted individual with a protein adequate, strength trained, properly aerobic based and well-fed individual, and show me that it's doubling lifespan. And I think it's bullshit. That's not, I just don't think it's going to happen. Almost everything that seems to be beneficial about calorie restriction looks identical to me to exercise. Like all of the adaptations there just look like exercise.
The growth hormone and
growth hormone and the shift towards more fat-centric metabolism and all this type of stuff. So I think like fasting can be valuable if people are unwilling to change diet. Then sometimes, you know, you tell them eat whatever you want, but only eat between like 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Then that may be a viable tool. But I don't think there's any other magic there. And I think that a bunch of people are gambling on this low protein. I see people in the ketogenic space there were people in the ketogenic space that were recommending 30 or 40 grams of protein a day because of this fear of mTOR. And the fucking 30 bananas a day guy, like Durian writer, like the crazy vegan guy, 30 bananas a day provides 40 grams of protein. So we have people in the ketogenic diet space recommending a dietary approach that's as dumb as 30 bananas a day, as you know, from like a protein perspective. And these people looked like shit, and they didn't look like they would handle themselves in a fight. They looked like if their car slid off of an icy road and they had to climb their way up and hike their way to civilization, that they would die in the process. And, you know, all of this is in this thought that like, well, I'm going to suppress mTOR, so I'm going to avoid cancer. I'm going to suppress mTOR, so I'm going to avoid neurodegenerative disease. All of that is completely speculative, and it is completely looking at the danger of cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease in an overfed state. We know that overfeeding is terrible. Well, what about just exercise and proper nutrition with adequate protein and not overeating calories? Like, there's a shocking difference there, and it's entirely speculative that a bunch of this protein restriction and fasting is going to benefit any of that stuff. But there's one other piece of this that from a longevity perspective, we all face. We all will face significant sarcopenia, loss of power production, loss of muscle as we age. And at the age of 30, that stuff starts happening. If you're not strength training, if you're not exercising, becomes ever more of a problem. And I just can't shake, like, even though we like to beat up on epidemiological studies when they don't go our way, but studies of older people, the folks that eat more protein do way better than the people eating low protein, just like way, way, way better. So all of this, like David Sinclair, Walter Longo, like low protein, I think it's bunk. I think it's absolute bunk. I think that they're taking all of the stuff out of context, and I won't know until I'm expired. We'll kind of see how all this stuff plays out. But I would make the case that if we eat adequate protein, fuel ourselves appropriately so that we can be strong and healthy and energetic today, that is absolutely our best hedge against aging later. And I just can't wrap my head around doing stuff that looks like aging, like sarcopenic processes are a bastard to undo as you get older. So under eating protein so that I avoid cancer, so that I can't get out of a chair and need to be institutionalized when I'm 75 or something. Like Roy Walford ended up not living all that long, and he was one of these huge caloric restriction proponents. And now that's one single case, but didn't do him magic, at all. And then you have someone like a Jack LaLanne who ate reasonably, was a bodybuilder, but was never one of the giant bodybuilders. But he always strength trained. He always did a little bit of cardio. He ate a adequate protein, whole food diet, and he died in his 90s. And he died as a complication from them trying to replace a heart valve. Like, arguably, they should have just left the damn heart valve alone because he was in his 90s, and he died from complications on the operating table. So I put far more stock in just trying to be a reasonable performance oriented organism as an aging hedge versus all this like magic biohacking, mTOR suppression and all that. I think that's going to end horribly for a lot of people.
That makes total sense. And I think it sounds a lot of what Dr. Gabrielle Leon's information says. You probably have talked to her, but
we're good pals.
Yeah. I
we're
love
good
her
pals.
stuff. And when I am working on myself or coaching female athletes, and I always say, you look what Dr. Gabrielle Leon says, and lift more weights, don't do the cardio stuff, get stronger. And what happens as you age? I mean, my parents just turned 80 last year, and I was at their house for Christmas, and, they don't move. They can't get up out of a chair. It's like, when you're a personal trainer, you see older clients, what happens if you don't eat protein and, they're eat carbs all the time and they have alcohol, and you can just see what happens. And we can totally prevent all of that if we just would move correctly, lift heavy things, and get our protein in. So I'm all aboard on that. Makes total sense that it's yin and yang, that Goldilocks effect. Not more is not better. Find the right amount for you as an individual. And all this, I think we're talking about, is customizing everything and individualizing what works best for you, fueling, training, performing, and intuitive eating and intuitive fueling, I like to say as well. So
yeah,
good.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I know we're out of time already, and I knew I could just chat for hours with you because you've got all these amazing studies and research and experiences you've done. And I will put everything in the show notes for everyone. Anything coming up in this year? Are you speaking at any conferences that they're hopefully happening?
I don't think so. We may do something here in the Montana area. Like one thing that I learned being, kind of off the grid, I really like not traveling, and I like being at events, but I don't like the going, and I don't like coming back from it. It just takes a big toll on me. But this Kalispell Glacier area is pretty nice, and people like to come here. So we're kicking around some ideas about doing some events here, and so maybe folks can come see me next year. I might get back out. I don't know, but it's funny. Like, I was on the road for the better part of 15 years. Like there was a 5-year period where I was gone 30 weeks a year. Wow. Probably, doing different gigs. And I just realized how my daughters are 7 and 9. So they're old enough that like the time with them is really valuable, and it's going by super fast. And I turned 50 here in a couple of days. And so my time is not forever. So I'm really, looking at some of that stuff now. Yeah.
Quality of life, I call it. And I said, I turned 50 November 5th, and I said, living my best life, my second half of my life, not having the craziness schedule. But I never really realized how much everyone that are speakers that I love, how much they traveled. Like Ben and Sean Wells said that, and other people just like, oh, it's nice to be home and not be gone every week, and being back and forth is exhausting and hard on your body. So I appreciate that. And it'd be great to, keep in touch on what the Montana event is, because we're always ready for a little adventure. And I think a lot of people want to do something fun with other people in a health space. So that would be great. So keep up what we're doing, and any good research, send it my way, as I have to explain to people more is not better.
Awesome, Debbie. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Rob.